Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to jump right straight into the presentation because I have a lot of information that I'm going to try to convey to you over the next 45 to 50 minutes, and would like to be able to leave some room for questions and answer at the end. So what we're going to talk about is initially introduction to medical product regulations, followed by medical device classification and market authorization, and really why these are so important. We're going to be looking at those in Canada, Europe, and the US. And we're going to talk about regulatory strategy and planning. Then we'll have some time for question and answers. So my hope is that by the end of this session, you'll understand the importance and process of medical product classification. You'll recognize the basic requirements for market authorization of medical devices, and you will leave here with possessing a working knowledge and the tools for the development of an effective regulatory strategy. I want to give credit where credit is due, and just to point out that a lot of the materials that I'm speaking of here today were co-developed with the industry experts who are presented on this slide while we were developing some programs for Health Innovation Hub, also known as H2I. So why are regulatory classifications necessary? In medical products, there is a tremendous range of different types and different classes. And they can range anywhere from a very mechanically simple sterile syringe to a mechanically highly complex artificial heart, as well as to the biochemically complex drugs and biologics that are available in the market today. Now, there are different regulations and requirements for each type of these products. And your regulatory success, in other words, your commercial success, is highly dependent on you having a complete understanding of your product and the regulations within your target markets. So this talk is really about medical devices, but I do want to start off with something very basic, and that is your technology a device or a drug? And it seems intuitively obvious to the most casual observer whether a product is a device or a drug most of the time, but there are occasions where it's not necessarily completely obvious. A product can be a drug, it can be a medical device, it can also be a combination product. If it's a drug, that's really a substance that's administered to the body in order to restore or correct physiological function or make a medical diagnosis through pharmacological interactions. If it's a medical device, you're really talking about an article that's used to diagnose, prevent, treat a disease, injury, or disability through mechanical interaction, either inside or outside of the body. It could also include devices used for control or support of conception and for cleaning and disinfection of medical devices. Now, a combination product is really something that combines two or more regulated components. So that could be a drug and a device, it could be a biologic and a device, a drug and a biologic, or all three of them combined. The importance of this will become apparent in just a minute. So, in the regulation of medical products, there are multiple federal regulators across the world. In Canada, the US, and Europe, they are respectively Health Canada, the Food and Drug Administration, and in Europe, there's actually a network of the European Medicines Agency. There are competent authorities, which are essentially the European health authorities, much like individual FDAs within the individual European countries, as well as notified bodies. Notified bodies are commercial entities that are actually authorized to audit manufacturers' quality systems and to conduct testing and reviews of medical devices on behalf of the competent authorities to ensure the compliance with the applicable regulations and standards. In this chart, I specifically want to draw your attention down to the combination products area, where it really talks about how these products are regulated with respect to the primary mechanism of action. So when we're talking about a drug, we're obviously talking about a primary mechanism of action, which is biochemical. When we're talking about a device, we're talking about a primary mechanism of action, which is predominantly mechanical. This will become important. Well, normally this is an audience interaction opportunities, but I'm going to go through it rather quickly so that you can get a sense as to how things can be complex in determining whether something's a drug, a device, or a combination product. So what we're looking at here is a product, its function, and we're going to decide whether it's a drug, a device, or a combination product. So if we're talking about a powered wheelchair, I think it's intuitively obvious to everyone this is a device. If we're talking about aspirin, pretty clear it's a drug. Let's talk about polymethyl methacrylate bone spacer, which is placed into a bone void in order to take up the space. It undergoes polymerization and forms a biodegradable mass, which ultimately fills the void. Would that be a drug or a device? It's not having a pharmacological effect on the body, therefore it is a device. Its function is mechanical. What about hydroxycobalamin? That's an antidote to cyanide. Probably pretty clear that that's a drug. How about a drug-coated angioplasty balloon? That's used to dilate stenotic arteries and to actually apply an antiproliferative drug to the vessel wall to prevent restenosis. Drug, device, sure everybody's wanting to say a combination product, but let's recall in one of the previous slides where we said the regulation of the combination product is really driven by its primary mechanism of action. Is the primary mechanism of action of a drug-coated angioplasty balloon going to fall under a drug category or a device category? In this situation, its MOA is going to be based on the fact that it mechanically dilates the vessel. The application of the drug is really to maintain that dilation as long as possible. And so that would be regulated as a device. If we had a drug-filled intraocular implant that's being delivered through a preloaded injector into the vitreous of the eye, that would, of course, be a combination product because we have the injector and we have the drug. However, the primary mode of action here is going to be the drug being released into the eye. What about a peritoneal dialysis solution? This one might get a little bit more complicated. And just think about for a second whether the solution would represent a drug or a device. The answer is, as most people in regulatory affairs like to say, it depends. The reason it depends is it is regulated differently in different markets. So peritoneal dialysis solutions in Canada and Europe are regulated as drugs, and in the United States they're regulated as medical devices. Disinfectant solutions also depend. Reason for that is that they're a medical device, natural health product, or over-the-counter drug in Canada. They're a medical device in the US, and they're either a medical device or a drug in Europe. So the reason I went through that is really to show you that it's not necessarily obvious of what the classification is based on A, what you might think, and B, just because it's regulated under a certain way in one country or one region, it will be regulated the same across the globe. That's certainly not the case. Let's focus on medical device classifications now for just a moment. Here, I want to show you that there is a difference between the various regions. And when we look in Canada, you see that there's a 4-level class system ranging from low risk to high risk for medical devices. In the United States, it's similar in terms of the hierarchy, except there are only 3 different classes. And in the European Union, again, the hierarchy is similar. However, there are 5 different classes, including 2 different class 1, 2 different class 2s, and a class 3. A little bit of a recap. We talked about peritoneal dialysis solutions before. In Canada, that would be a pharmaceutical. In the US, that's a medical device. In EMA, it is a medicinal product or a drug. These disinfectant solutions could be a class 2 medical device in Canada, could be a class 1 or 2 medical device in the US, could be a class 2A or 2B in Europe. However, in Canada, it could also be a pharmaceutical or natural health product, could also be a drug, classified as a drug in Europe. Powered wheelchairs. It's a class 1 product in Canada, class 1 medical device, I should say, in Canada. It's a class 2 medical device in the US and a class 2A in Europe. Those peripheral angioplasty balloons. The highest risk classification in Canada is at a class 4, while a modest classification risk in both US and in EMA. This is why it is important to understand how to perform classifications in each of the individual jurisdictions and countries. We're going to move on to doing that in just a few moments. So, your product classification really is key to your regulatory success, in other words, achieving your approval. Your product classification is going to determine whether or not you need an establishment license and representation within those regions. I'll explain that shortly. But it also defines a type of market authorization application that you're submitting into the regulators. As an example, in the US, is your device application going to be a very extensive, long, and intense pre-market application document, which can be literally thousands of pages of data? Or is it going to be a 510K, which is usually a far more brief summary of your product, its manufacturing, and a comparison to other products that are currently on the market? Those have very different composition and very different timelines for review. Market authorization application you do will then determine the extent of the clinical and non-clinical evidence requirements, as well as the time, the resources, and the costs that you will incur to produce them. So let's get into talking about classifications specifically by regions. I'm going to start with Canada. This is the actual document that will provide those classifications. In the handout materials that Ahmed was referring to earlier, there is a web links document that contains most of the documents that I'm going to refer to, and it does include this one as well, so no need to be writing anything. Within the classification rules for non-in vitro diagnostic medical devices, there are 16 different rules within the Canadian medical device regulations. We have invasive devices, we have non-invasive devices, active devices, and the special rules. One of the things that I will show you just very quickly, this is just an image of one of the pages showing the active devices. Those active devices contain 5 separate rules. We'll look into those in a little bit. Maybe we can apply them to this question. Here's an oximeter. Is it a class 1, 2, 3, or 4 medical device? Well, we can go back to the page that we were looking at just a moment ago, and this is quite an eye chart, so we'll add on a little bit of clarity here, and we can look through. Let's start with Rule 8. That oximeter we were looking at, does it emit ionizing radiation? No. Rule 9, does it administer or withdraw energy to or from the body? No. Rule 10, does it image or monitor physiological processes? Yes, it does monitor a physiological process. In this case, Rule 11 doesn't apply, and since we've already found one that does apply, Rule 10, that means that Rule 12 does not apply since it refers to all others. When we look at this, we can look down from Rule 10 and see it's a Class 2. There are other provisions that it may apply to, but what we've discovered from this analysis is that the spot check oximeter is a Class 2 by Rule 10.1. But there's more than one kind of oximeter. So just because it's called an oximeter does not mean all oximeters are going to be a Class 2. Remember what we saw back here, that although it was determined to be a Class 2, that this unless comes into play, and if erroneous readings could result in immediate danger, it becomes a Class 3. I think it's probably obvious that erroneous readings in an OR setting with an anesthetized patient could result in immediate danger. Therefore, in this particular case, the oximeter is a Class 3 by Rule 10.2. Again, trying to reinforce the fact that it's important to know how to do the classification and the appropriate way to do that. Important to recognize that the manufacturer has to take into consideration all of the rules. Don't just read a few of them and find one that applies and consider your job done. you need to find all the different rules a device may fall under. In the end, the final classification is going to be determined by the rule that assigns the highest risk. Health Canada acknowledges that the rule system has limitations and can't accommodate every single device, so they do welcome a conversation about classification. However, anytime that there's a discrepancy between the manufacturer and Health Canada wins. Now, we're living in a bit of a different era right now, and there's a lot of interest in vitro diagnostic devices. This is really all I'm going to talk about on this slide, and pointing out that the classification of IVDDs follows a very similar rules-based approach as the non-IVDDs. And there are classes 1 through 4. There are 9 distinct rules as opposed to the 16. And there's a guidance document that includes simplified flow diagrams, similar to the ones that we looked at just a few moments ago. And this link is included in the web links page that's provided in the online handouts. This is a bit of an eye chart, but it's really intended to illustrate how and contrast the differences between Class 1 medical devices and the requirements that are associated with Class 1 medical devices relative to Class 2s, 3s, and 4s. One of the most unique things about a Class 1 device is they are exempt from requiring a medical device license, which means that there is no application required. You can essentially self-certify your device and put it on the market without any form of application. You must ensure that it has a compliant label and that you retain objective evidence of the safety and effectiveness of the device. Your quality management system, if you have one, does not have to be certified. However, you do have to have a system by which you maintain distribution records of the products that you sell, ensure that you have a complaint handling system, and that you have a system that will allow compliant mandatory problem reporting. In other words, reporting to the health authorities in the event that your product, you receive a report about your product causing harm or potential harm to a patient or caregiver. You must also have a process for conducting recalls, should that be necessary, and you must have a medical device establishment license. I'm going to talk about those in more detail in just a moment. What is a medical device establishment license? So an MDL is not the same as a medical device license, which is what you apply for to be able to market an individual product. An MDL is actually issued for the activities of importing and selling medical devices that are for human use in Canada. It's issued by the Health Canada Inspectorate, and it's based on you certifying that you have met certain requirements. They usually require an inspection in order to ensure that you meet those requirements. So anyone who imports a medical device into Canada or sells one in Canada for human use must have a medical device establishment license. Unless that individual or entity is a retailer, a healthcare facility, if it's someone who manufactures a Class 2, 3, or 4 medical device and only sells medical devices for which they have a valid medical device license, or they're only selling product or distributing product that is custom made or for the purposes of clinical trials. They could also be a manufacturer of Class 1 medical device that only imports or distributes through an MDL holder, or they could be a dispenser, and a dispenser is often a care agency such as CCAC, who may provide patients with, say, for example, a wheelchair or a walker or some other assistive device. So how do you get an MDL if you need one? This information is not in the web links page, so if you wanted to just jot down the GUI 0016 and FRM 0292, that will make it easy for locating those on Health Canada's website should you have an interest in securing an MDL. These two documents make the process fairly simple. So as we've seen for device classification in Canada, we start at low risk and go from risk classes 1 through 4. Class 1 requires an MDEL. Class 2 requires the establishment license, but they also require application for a medical device license and certification of their quality management system under ISO 13485. And that applies to classes 2, 3, and 4. So with respect to the quality management system, what are those requirements? Well, ISO 13485 specifies requirements for your QMS, or your quality management system. Any organization that is going to be designing or manufacturing medical devices needs to demonstrate its ability to provide those devices and the services associated with those devices that will consistently meet the customer and regulatory requirements. And just some of those basic requirements are document and record control, ensuring management responsibility and accountability, that there is appropriate resource management to ensure the ongoing supply and safe, high quality supply of those products, that design controls are followed. In other words, that the product does not get changed without it being documented and applied for a subsequent authorization to sell that changed product. Or product manufacturing must follow good manufacturing practices, or GMP regulations. And then you ensure that there is measurement, analysis, and improvement systems within your manufacturing and commercialization processes. Excuse me. So in quick summary, how do you bring a product to market in Canada? Well, for a medical device, you would first formulate your TPP, or your target product profile. There is a template for that in the handouts. I'll talk more about that later. Within your TPP, you will include your indications for use, your target claims, your intended use, and a lot of other information that you have about your product. And for that information that you don't have, you will provide your assumptions about what that information will be. Once you've formulated your target product profile, you'll then use that information to classify your device according to the classification rules. You'll implement a quality system that's in compliance with 13485 and have that reviewed by a registrar, and have them issue your certificate, because of course it will be compliant. You're going to verify and validate that your device satisfies the essential requirements for effectiveness and safety under the Canadian Medical Device Regulations sections 10 through 20. To prepare your license submission, you'll submit that license submission to the Medical Devices Bureau. Somewhere in there, you're going to be applying for your MDEL, and then ultimately you'll get your medical device license and commercialize. Easy peasy. Let's talk about Europe. This will be a little bit more brief. So medical device classification in the European Union follows a very similar process as in Canada. It kind of ends there because it's only the process that is similar. The rules are different. There are 22 instead of 16. The definitions are different, and the classifications are different. I already mentioned that the classifications are 2 1s, 2 2s, and a 3. So there's 5 different classification levels. And in case you're interested, these are the 22 different rules. I'll leave this slide on for a moment if you wanted to memorize them. We're not actually going to go through the rules and do any practice with them as we did with the rules from Canada, but as I mentioned, the process is the same. So they're quite easy to follow, and I'm sure you can follow rules better than I can. But let's talk about who the critical players are in the European market, because this is where it may get a little bit confusing. I mentioned who the competent authorities are. Those are the regulatory authorities that enforce the medical device regulations within each EU member state or country. The notified bodies, those are commercial entities that the manufacturers actually pay to come in and audit their quality systems and to test and review their devices to ensure that they are compliant with the European Union regulations and standards, and then report back to the competent authorities that the device is compliant or is not compliant, based on the notified body's assessment as well as that of the competent authority. The competent authority will essentially bless the product for a marketing authorization. I also want to talk about authorized representatives. If you're going to be interacting with a regulatory authority within Europe, you need to have an authorized European representative. If you do not have a location within Europe, if you don't have staff within Europe, then you would have to assign that to someone who may be a professional representative. It's important to understand what the ramifications of this are. This is the individual who will be doing your regulatory correspondence. This is who the competent authorities and notified bodies will communicate with. They will, and they need to be able to get a response immediately. What that means is that you need to be sharing confidential information with this representative. So it needs to be a highly trusted representative. Quick overview of EU conformity requirements. If we're talking about a class 1 non-sterile or non-measuring medical device, you can simply self-declare your compliance to the medical device regulations and put the product on the market, provided you have the appropriate labeling, etc. If it's a class 1 sterile or measuring or higher risk classification, your QMS must be certified to ISO 13485, and your product must undergo an assessment by a notified body with your technical file and a clinical evaluation report. A clinical evaluation report does not necessarily mean a clinical trial. It does mean that you have looked at the potential risk and benefit of using that product in humans. And that can be done through literature searches. Then lastly, if it's a class 2B or class 3 product approaching the highest risk, the assessment of the notified body will also include clinical trial data. So if you have a higher risk product, you can be fairly confident that you will require a clinical trial in Europe. Similar to Canada, in order to do your regulatory submission in Europe for a medical device, you would have your TPP. You would then classify your device according to classification rules within the MDRs, the medical device regulations for Europe. You would implement your quality system in compliance with ISO 13485, prepare your submission, appoint your EC representative, and then have that notified body come in and inspect your quality system, as well as your technical file. If you have a combination product, they would also be conducting a medicines review by the EMA or a competent authority. Following the appropriate review period, your notified body will issue the CE certificate. You will receive approval from the competent authority, and you may then apply that CE mark and commercialize your product. So let's move into the US for a little bit. US device classification has a completely different approach than what we've seen in Canada and Europe. In Canada and the EU, they have a systematic rules-based approach, and the US takes a different tact. They impose regulatory controls based on risk. They use a predicate-based system. In other words, they regulate medical devices based on medical devices that they have reviewed and approved historically. Devices are all categorized based on product codes and classifications. 3 different classes of medical devices, and those are based on the different levels of regulatory control, which include, first, general controls. Those require an annual registration with the FDA by the manufacturer. That manufacturer follows good manufacturing practice regulations, that labeling regulations are followed for the product, and that a pre-market notification is filed unless it is considered exempt. There are also special controls, and that could be compliance to performance standards. That could include things like electrical safety standards. There may be special labeling requirements because of risks. And also, they may impose post-marketing surveillance because there may be added risks or other areas of concern that they would want to be maintaining surveillance for in the longer term. In a situation like that, that will almost always be a 510K or higher. And then lastly, this is the more complex submission that I discussed earlier. That's the pre-market approval. Those involve general and special controls. When those come into play when general and special controls are not adequate to ensure that the device is safe and effective. And it's used to ensure that sufficient valid scientific evidence is assessed to prove that the device is safe and effective for its intended use. A class 1 device is always, again, considered low risk. It's subject to general controls only, and that would include something such as an adhesive bandage, Band-Aid, an IV stand, and these are usually 510K exempt. Class 2 products are considered moderate risk, where general controls and special controls are put into play. This would include the powered wheelchairs, infusion pumps, surgical drapes, and these usually fall under a 510K. Class 3 products are the higher risk products. Those will involve the general controls and must undergo a pre-market approval application. That would include high risk products such as replacement heart valves, silicone gel-filled breast implants, pacemakers, and again, they will always follow under a PMA. If we look at a 510K exempt, those types of products, no submission is required, and about 95% of class 1 devices and perhaps 10% of class 2 devices fall under that category. It is unlikely that any clinical trial data will be required to support bringing that product to market. For pre-market notification, commonly known as 510Ks, the device has to be shown to be at least as safe and effective as a legally marketed device in the United States that has not been the subject of a pre-market approval. And clinical studies are required probably 10 to 15% of the time. If a pre-market approval is required, you're almost always going to have clinical studies required for that. And that's really the case for any class 3 device. Focus there is really on scientific clinical regulatory review for safety and effectiveness. You see the performance standard numbers I have in there. I didn't actually vocalize those because in the age of COVID, you can disregard those numbers. They're missing those quite frequently. So how do you actually classify your device in the US? The answer to that is really probably a 2-hour workshop to be able to go through the process. However, it is somewhat intuitive once you're able to get into the databases. So you can do so by searching for a corresponding marketed device via the FDA product code classification database. I provided the link to it here, but you'll also find that link in the web links page in the online handouts. I would encourage you to go in if you have an interest in this and look at if you go onto that link, on the right-hand side, you'll see PMA database and you'll see 510K database. And those will be your pathways in to look at various types of devices that may apply to the product that you wish to bring to market. So I know you're thinking, what if my device is so innovative that there's nothing like it in the FDA's classification database? If that's the case, congratulations. But also what you want to do in that situation like that is reach out to the FDA very early in your product development planning and use what's called the 513G request for information submission. That will allow you to get feedback from the FDA on what your device should be classified as from their perspective. But what you're encouraged to do is provide your understanding of what the classification would be and the justification for that, and then ask the FDA if they concur. It is not a good idea just to send your information to them and say, what classification is this? They will come back and say it's class 3. which is the case for the default position for any previously unclassified excuse me, device for which there is no predicate. Now, in the event that that happens, you do have some recourse, and that is to follow the de novo regulatory pathway, which is another submission that would allow you to reclassify it into a class 1 or a class 2 if that can be justified based on the device's risk. So I mentioned a little bit about feedback from the FDA, and it is, or actually any regulatory authority, it is extraordinarily valuable to follow that path. You can usually only do it once, perhaps twice in your development times prior to actually going into human clinical trials. Processes in place for Health Canada, the European Union with the individual competent authorities, and with the FDA. Canada and the US, there are no fees attached to it. The competent authorities in the European Union do charge a fee, and it's not insignificant. Very important that if you are going to seek their guidance, or sorry, I shouldn't say seek their guidance. If you are going to seek their advice, make sure you carefully read and follow the requirements for getting that feedback from each of the authority, as they provide it very clearly on their websites. Generally, what happens is within 2 to 3 weeks of you sending your letter requesting such an interaction, you'll receive notification of a meeting that will be taking place within 60 to 90 days. You need to be prepared in advance of this by already having your submission document, which will be a very detailed document that you will send them describing the design of your product, the manufacturing of your product, the preclinical testing, any clinical testing, and how you intend to bring it to market. That I strongly recommend that you have in near final format before you even send your letter requesting for the interaction. Important don'ts. Don't ask them for guidance because you will be told that they are not your consultant, but do ensure that you have a very well outlined plan within your submission document, and then ask if the authority agrees with your proposed approach. Also, don't meet unnecessarily. If a written response or simply a teleconference will be adequate, then take that route as opposed to insisting on a face-to-face meeting. Okay, I'm going to spend a few minutes now talking about strategy. So for those of you who are involved in innovation, product development, this or some form of this pie chart is probably familiar to you. And as you go down the path of innovation, there are things that you know, and you soon learn about those things that you now know you don't know. And then there's a larger slice of the pie, which are the things that you think you know, but you're not quite sure. And as you go further down the road, you begin to realize that there's a whole lot that you don't know yet. One of the ways of handling this is developing your regulatory strategy. As you develop your regulatory strategy, it's going to help you to minimize those known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, those things that you don't know yet. Because an understanding of all the variables that are going to affect your regulatory strategy is going to help you understand and develop a very effective regulatory plan. It's going to drive effective interactions with investors, development and marketing partners, regulatory agencies, and consultants. So let's talk about the what, when, where, and how of regulatory strategy and planning. I talked before about the TPP, the target product profile, and that's really the what. It's a high definition description of the product and its characteristics and performance that you intend to impart on that product. Your regulatory strategy is really going to define your when and where. That's going to help you prioritize which regulatory applications you will be putting into place first, which markets you will be going to first. The detailed analysis of your target market conditions, the regulatory requirements in those markets, And it's going to drive how you prioritize each of those regional marketing applications. And the final part is the how. That's going to be your plan. And that is going to be country specific or region specific. It's that detailed blueprint of all that you're going to do, all the milestones, all of the obligations that you have in each of those target markets. It's going to tell you what the deliverables are going to be, when you anticipate achieving those, what resources you're going to require, and who is going to be holding the responsibilities, accountabilities, and authorities. It will provide clear direction to the development and commercialization team members in your organization. Let's talk a little bit more about the target product profile. There is a template available in the handouts that will help you develop your target product profile. It includes a device description. That's a detailed description of the product. It includes the design, manufacturing, and clinical features. It has your intended use statement. So what are the conditions that it's going to be used upon, and what population will it apply to? How is it going to be administered? What's the environment it's going to be used in? Is it hospital, home, excuse me, a clinic, etc.? What types of claims are you going to associate with this product? This is very important because your claims could drive changes in your risk classification levels. Just by making certain claims, you can jump from a class 1 device to a class 3 quite easily. You're going to talk about what the clinical effectiveness is or its expectations are, the intolerability of the product, look at health economics. So what is the value of the indications and the claims, and how much is it going to cost? Is it going to even be affordable for the patient population out there? How often is it used? How often can it sit on a shelf? What are the conditions for shipping? What are the conditions of warehousing, sterility assurance, and your time to market availability? How long is this going to take you to actually develop? You need to be honest with yourself about this one. How long is it going to take to fully develop? In other words, have a packaged, labeled, commercial stage product that you can put into the hands of a clinician and charge them money for it. So your regulatory strategy is going to define those regional priorities. So once you have the strategy and you know, and you've worked your way through it, you're going to know which regions you need to go into first, based on all the data that you've summarized. And that regulatory strategy is going to be informed by the product-specific components that you'll have listed out in your target product profile, and they will be specific to one or more regions. So your reimbursement is going to play a major role in that decision-making. What is the regulatory environment like? What is the epidemiology like? How many patients actually have it have that condition in a certain country versus other countries? The data that's developed during your regulatory strategy, the data that's acquired during the development of your regulatory strategy will derive your regulatory plan for each individual regulatory jurisdiction. I've already talked about this, and we've gone through what's in a regulatory strategy, but just to point out, all of this information is also included in a handout. So it's a template that you can use to help you build your regulatory strategy. In order to build your regulatory strategy, you're going to want to perform some regulatory intelligence, which is really that systematic approach to gather and analyzing the available data that will guide your strategy. So you're going to be looking at monitoring regulatory changes in the various markets, compare regulatory submissions and clinical trial requirements across countries. You want to identify regulatory approaches that others have taken in the past, both successful ones and unsuccessful ones. You need to design, develop, and then validate any preclinical strategies. Are you going to be doing enough to be able to justify taking this product into humans, or taking this product for clinical trials, or taking this product to market? Make sure you understand the regulatory, clinical, and reimbursement strategies for all of the predicate products and likely competitors that you're going to encounter. Analyze the data and prioritize the markets that you're going to be addressing based on those regulatory requirements, the reimbursement status, again, the epidemiologic variances, and ensuring that your product actually has a fit within the local practice pattern in those jurisdictions that you're going to approach for authorization. There are a lot of sources for regulatory intelligence, and that is regulatory agency websites, company websites, specifically looking at press releases and investor information, financial disclosures such as 10K filings and minutes of quarterly investor calls and investor decks are extraordinarily full of valuable information when you're doing competitive intelligence or regulatory intelligence. Find publications, presentations, and abstracts, clinical trials registries. Consultants are always helpful, and even sometimes promotional advertising materials and patents are very useful. So when you're prioritizing the market that you are going to be going to first, there are so many things you need to consider, but first and foremost is money. You have to prioritize those regions for market authorizations based on how long is it going to take you to get to the market, because time is money, and it could be that some lower value markets are going to require less data and have shorter approval times. You need to be thinking about getting into markets where you can start to generate the cash that you are going to need to be able to support the regulatory requirements, such as clinical trials, that will be required to get you into some of the other perhaps higher paying markets later on down the road. You need to consider what your regulatory costs are going to be, your regulatory approval and your manufacturing and distribution costs. So consider those regulatory costs, your transportation, your warehouse, taxes, tariffs, packaging, label changes, translations, all of those items that go into making a decision about which will be the earliest markets that you will attempt to penetrate. And of course, your ROI, your market value, you've got to follow that money. Who is going to be paying for this product? Who can pay for the product? What is the status of reimbursement within the markets that you're looking at? What is the status of competition within that market? And what are those practice patterns? Lastly, we're going to talk about a regulatory plan. And again, for this, templates are provided within the handouts. For your regulatory plan, you want to identify who the regulatory agencies are within that target market. Figure out and these are specific to one region. In your plan, you're going to build that plan so that you're going to know exactly where you're going with your timelines, your milestones, and the accountabilities. Make sure that you have identified all the regulatory references that you need to identify for your particular products, that being the regulations that apply to them, the guidance documents that may apply to them. Make sure that you have identified all of the quality standards, testing standards that are device specific for your product. Make sure you have comparisons to the products that are marketed within that region. You need to have a very solid assessment of where your product was going to fit into the market. Have justification, solid justification for any claims that you're intending to apply to your product. That includes what's going to be going on your labels. Ensure that you have your preclinical, clinical, and clinical strategy set out, including your protocols and any reports. If there's any supporting literature. And then lastly, the summaries of the actions of any meetings that you may have had with regional regulatory agencies or other international agencies. And that's all I have for now. I hope we still have a few minutes for Q&A.
Frank, thank you so much for such an insightful and very comprehensive talk. And as you nicely described it, I'm certain that you have minimized a lot of, the known unknowns and unknowns for many of our participants tonight. So thank you very much for that. And yeah, I guess we are going to open up for questions. I actually do have a question, Frank. A lot of startups, can benefit from using one market as a kind of a stepping stone to another, to enter another. And I'm just wondering, based on my limited experience, I'm sure you have more extensive experience. I've not seen a company that started selling their product in Canada before they actually did in the US. So I'm just wondering, does that mean innovators should almost always focus on regulatory clearance in the US or EU before thinking about going for a Health Canada approval?
Yeah. Those of us who work in regulatory are, our favorite breakfast is a waffle and our favorite plant is a hedge. So I'm going to say that depends.
Okay.
The you're right. Most of the time, the target is going to be the U.S. There may be some instances, and I have seen instances where products have been approved that have been submitted almost simultaneously and have been approved more quickly in Canada than they have in the U.S.
Mhm.
The situation in the European Union is changing right now because of the new medical device regulations that were supposed to come into force, meaning that they applied to everybody as of May 19th of this year. But COVID put a stop to that, and that has been deferred. It was going into law to May 19th, 2021. However, what it involves is reviews by a lot of notified bodies and competent authorities for products that had pre-existed on the market and then needed to be re-reviewed. So that's created a massive bottleneck of submissions that exist in Europe right now and are really slowing approval.
Okay.
So I wouldn't count on being able to get a rapid approval in Europe for a medical device. So I honestly would say that right now, especially in the era of COVID, it's a bit of a crapshoot as to where you're going to be able to get your approvals completed faster. So the other, and I realize I'm really waffling and hedging on this, but the other thing to keep in mind is that I'm sorry, I lost that train of thought, and
Okay.
I'll come back to it later.
It's okay. No problem. I actually have one more question on like something I would just wish to clarify. So because you talked about the differences between Canada and the US, and is it fair to say that an MDL in Canada is equivalent to the FDA 510K pathway for classes 2 and 3, and perhaps an MDL for class 4 in Canada is more comparable to a PMA pathway?
So yes, a class 4 medical device license application would be analogous to a PMA in the U.S.
Okay. Okay.
The a class 3 approaches that. It actually falls somewhere in the middle, and a class 2 is far closer to a 510K.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah, it's hard to draw direct analogies between the two. They're, but absolutely a class 4 device application or medical device license in Canada would be analogous to a PMA application in the US.
Okay. Sounds good. I don't see any questions from the audience. Feel free if you have any questions. We still have a couple of minutes, but
What I might do is put up my email address, if that
yeah.
would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you so much, Frank. So if any of the audience, if you have any questions that even comes afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me with the questions or reach out to Frank directly. Thank you again so much, Frank, for this.
Yeah. See if I can.
Do you want me to paste your email in the chat box?
If that would work, sure.
Sure. Yep.
I don't know if it's showing up on the screen right now.
Oh, sorry. I pasted another email. Sorry about that.
Oh,
Uh,
Ripple Therapeutics is fine. They both work.
okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
So I have two employers. I have Interface Biologics and Ripple Therapeutics, and I do the same thing for both companies.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Frank. So everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. You have Frank's email. Feel free to reach out to him directly. And thank you for joining us today. Again, please remember we don't have a lecture scheduled for next week. We do have the Innovation Day. I've posted the link again on the chat box. It would be amazing if you guys can all join us for the Innovation Day. Again, a full day with a lot of insights and learnings on medical device innovation and commercialization. Again, a quick reminder for MBP students, we have a tutorial class at 6:15. So please take a break and we'll see you at 6:15. Thank you again, Frank, and thank you again, everyone, and please have a good night.
Pleasure.
Goodbye.
Bye.